So I've been living in the Netherlands for a little over a year. I think I just crossed the 13-month mark and I'm kind of closing in on the 14-month mark. And given that I've been here for so long, the novelty of being in a new country has pretty much worn off. As a matter of fact, when my girlfriend and I visited London and Antwerp last year, when we got back to the Netherlands, I actually felt this sense of peace and calm that you would only really feel, I think I just walked into a dead end, I'm gonna go this way, but that you would only generally feel when returning home from an unfamiliar place. I'm saying this to say that the Netherlands, for all intents and purposes, has sort of become a second home for me. And I think that at this point, it always will be a second home for me. That said, although the general novelty of living in a new country has worn off, I still find that there are differences embedded within the culture here that never fail to amaze me, especially in how they manifest themselves in your day-to-day experience. Bearing that in mind, in this video, I want to talk about some of the biggest culture shocks that I still experience after having lived in the Netherlands for a full calendar year. And I want to break this down into three different categories because there are three components of this culture shock: people, places, and things. Let's start with the people. So I've talked about this in other videos, but Dutch people are a lot friendlier than I expected. That's the first thing that I think still surprises me, is how friendly people are to me. And it's not because I'm an American or a foreigner and they just want to make me feel at home. No, people are friendly without even knowing the context of who I am or what I'm doing here or why I'm here. They're just friendly for the sake of being friendly. And I've come to realize it's just because that's a part of who they are. Let me actually get off the street before I get hit, because everybody's friendly until they get behind the wheel of a car. But I digress. I've noticed that Dutch people are very friendly, very outgoing, and that's been a very pleasant surprise for me, and it continues to surprise me to this day, where especially older people, I've noticed, when you're walking past them on the street, they're gonna make the eye contact with you, they're gonna expect you to make the eye contact with them, and at the very least, you do the little head nod and ahoy, hello, goedemiddag, something to that effect. I've noticed that people here do value those small interactions much more than I expected them to. And again, I see this as a good thing, even though I'm an introvert who, I'm not gonna lie, do still struggle with social anxiety. I definitely do. Even filming these videos out in public like this, when there's nobody around me, still makes me a little bit nervous. But it definitely helps ease my soul when I see people making the attempt to bridge that gap with me, even if I'm not in the mood at that point in time to meet them in the middle there. I still do my best to do that, but still, it's very pleasant to see that. And it speaks volumes about how considerate people here are. And that word considerate, let me actually, I don't know where I'm supposed to walk in this neighborhood because I don't see a sidewalk. But anyways, that word considerate is sort of indicative of a deeper truth, a deeper principle that I've noticed not just individuals, but Dutch society as a whole seems to adhere to, and that is doe normaal. Now, what is doe normaal? Translated into English, literally, it means act normal. And I think there is something else at the end of that quote. There's more context behind it. I don't know the Dutch saying, but I believe translated to English, it's something along the lines of act normal and that's crazy enough, or something to that effect. And I've seen some people have a very negative perception of this saying, and I understand why, because listen, I am as much of an individualist as anybody that you know. Being an individualist has served me very well in life. It is the reason why I had the audacity to make this move in the first place, to move to a country that not only had I never been to, but nobody that I knew in real life had ever been to before either. You can't make moves like that being a conformist. But maybe conformist is not a fair synonym to assign to the saying "do normal." Maybe a more accurate word would be collectivist. I feel like here in the Netherlands, people tend to have a more collectivist mindset, and this permeates every component of day-to-day existence. Now, what do I mean by collectivist? Well, basically, by collectivist, I mean that people here seem to have much more regard for how the things that they do influence and impact those around them. So, for example, when my girlfriend and I go to the grocery store, sometimes we get food from the frozen food section. I know it's not the healthiest thing, but quite frankly, I don't really like to cook. She doesn't really like to cook. And so we just make it work the best that we can. And sometimes that means eating frozen food. One of the first times we went to the grocery store together here in the Netherlands, we were in the frozen food section, and I was looking through the different French fries or maybe vegan pizza, something like that. And I had the door open. Let me actually go through the woods here and get a little more nature. But I had the freezer door open, and after a few seconds, my girlfriend was like, "Hey, you need to close the door." And I was like, "Why do I need to close the door? I'm still not done looking." And obviously there's glass so you can look through, but still, I just didn't really see why I needed to close the door. And she told me, because it's bad for the environment. It's wasteful. And listen, my girlfriend, she is someone who loves animals. I love animals too, hence vegan pizza. But I never really took her to be an environmentalist in that regard. So it definitely shocked me when she said that. But what I've realized over time is that it's not just a her thing, it's just embedded within the culture. Let me actually sit down here for a little bit. But it's just embedded within the cultural mechanism of the Netherlands, of Dutch people. People here have much more regard for not just the environment overall, but how climate change and how the destruction of the environment affects themselves and other people. And I find that to be really admirable, because I think that in America, we have a long way to go in that regard. We have a very, very long way to go, because, I mean, you tell somebody that they need to close the freezer door in America and they're gonna look at you crazy. They're gonna look at you absolutely crazy, because people just don't care. They're not thinking about climate change. They're thinking about, and maybe that's a bit misleading to say, there are definitely a lot of environmentalists in the US who do care about climate change and are taking massive action to reverse or at least slow down the effects of climate change. But by and large, as a society, again, Americans tend to be very individualist, for better and for worse. It's good when it inspires you to take a leap of faith, step beyond your comfort zone, and move to a different country to get a different perspective on life. It's bad when you're in that country and you don't respect the standards of just upholding the environment. And this isn't to say that I'm out here littering or anything like that. It's more just, I didn't know. I didn't have that sort of knowledge, that frame of reference, because we're not really taught stuff like that growing up back home. So obviously, she has been taught stuff like that. And even just thinking about how you have all of these different trash bins for different types of waste, we don't have that. I don't even think our neighborhood got recycling bins until I was probably 15 years old, or somewhere in my teen years. Before that, everything just went into the trash can, and that was just normal. And I'm not gonna lie, as a kid, I found it to be a bit inconvenient to have to go through the process of sifting through my trash and organizing it, but here, that's normal. And so that inconvenience isn't even an inconvenience, it's an awareness of how you are playing your part in making the world a better place. Now, on the topic of places, because the people ultimately constitute the place, on the topic of places, this collectivist mindset manifests itself in the infrastructure that you see here. What do I mean by that? Well, Back home in Texas, everything is very spread out. It's car oriented, car dependent actually, I would say. And it's just generally a very, very individual place. It's a place for individuals. Whereas here, if you look at the way that these neighborhoods are constructed, everything is dense. People don't have super big yards. In this part of the Netherlands, they have larger yards, but I mean, this is kind of standard back home. Everything is more dense. Everything is more accessible. You have public transit, you have bike lanes, and all of this, of course, is coming from taxpayer dollars. So people are willing to pay higher taxes to ensure accessibility for all. And of course, there are exceptions to this, but by and large, maybe because in part, a lot of people are benefiting from that accessibility, that just seems to be the norm. That's the standard here. Back home, that's just not the case. I mean, we have a DART train. It's called the DART Dallas Area Rapid Transit. It's not really the same. It's basically a glorified trolley that has maybe 3 or 4 lines and doesn't really get you anywhere. Completely unreliable, for most people at least. But here, everything is constructed in such a way that everyone benefits. And the only way that something like that is possible, the only way that it's possible to collect taxpayer dollars to be able to do something like that, is if people vote for it. So people have to choose it for themselves. So this collectivist mentality is what informs the infrastructure, not the other way around. Maybe there's sort of this feedback loop where the infrastructure informs the collectivist mentality, and then the collectivist mentality informs the infrastructure, and the cycle perpetuates. And maybe that's why the US is sort of getting worse and worse and worse, because it's doing the same thing in the opposite direction. Or maybe I'm just yapping, I don't know. But what I do know is that there is a pronounced difference in day-to-day life because the places are structured differently. I don't have a car. My girlfriend doesn't have a car. She has her Dutch driver's license, but we aren't renting any cars while we're here at this Airbnb. We rented bikes, and that's enough. We use the bikes. If we need to go anywhere further, we can take the bikes to the bus stop, ride the bus. If we need to go any further than that, we take the train. Any further than that, we take a plane. But in a town like this, a town of less than 20,000 inhabitants, that wouldn't be possible back home. In fact, the city that I come from, Louisville, Texas, has 100,000 plus people. And it's basically, I'm not going to say impossible to rely on your bike, but it's very difficult because you don't want to ride in the street because you will get hit. Okay, I've come very close to being hit many, many times. And you can't not ride on the street because there are no bike lanes. So this sort of lifestyle is effectively impossible back home, but it's normal here simply because of the collectivist mentality. And I'm not saying it's better or worse, it's definitely different. And I think that if we do choose to leave the Netherlands, which if we do, it very likely won't be for the US, it'll probably be for another foreign country, but I digress. If we do choose to leave the Netherlands, I will miss the infrastructure, which by extension means that I will also miss the collectivist mentality. And I say that, once again, as an individualist myself. Now, how do the people and the places relate to the things? What things am I referring to? Well, basically, because people here tend to be more collectivist, and because infrastructure is catered to the masses rather than the top 1% of people, I've noticed that people here tend to value things a lot less. Because why would you need a really nice car if you don't need a car at all? And if you have, let's say for example, road tax, you have to pay extra road tax on your big car, your G-Wagon, your Range Rover, etc. You have to pay road tax on that based on the weight of the car, because that road tax, I'm assuming, goes right back into the infrastructure, into making everything more accessible for everyone. you're disincentivized from getting those more, I don't want to say better things, because sometimes things are more expensive but they're not actually better, but just getting these more luxurious, extravagant things. It seems like Dutch people tend to be a lot more practical, and I think that's because practicality and collectivism go hand in hand, because generally collectivists are practical. Collectivism as a philosophy is practical. And again, this can be a bad thing and a good thing. It's good in the sense that it can allow for infrastructure like this and allow for everyone to live better, but it can be bad because it can also inhibit people from pursuing the adventurous component of their spirits. So there's a give and a take with that, and I think I've sort of found my Goldilocks zone, my sweet spot, my compromise. But I've definitely found that people here are far less materialistic, because most material things, the desire for most material things, that is rooted in the desire for status. It's rooted in the underlying desire for status, and that's a human thing. That's not just an American thing. Everybody everywhere wants status. The difference is that here in the Netherlands, you get status from being a collectivist, not from being better than the rest or different than the rest. You get status for contributing to the well-being of those around you. So the underlying core desire is the same, the principle is the same, but the means of achieving that desire is not just different, but it's literally the complete opposite. It's diametrically opposed. And again, whether you think this is a good thing or a bad thing is subjective. It's up to personal preference. But what I found is that, in my experience, it's pretty much overwhelmingly a good thing, because it increases the general quality of life of your average person here. And anytime you see an increase, an improvement in the quality of life of the average person, you're gonna have a happier society. You're gonna have a happier, more friendly society where you have people just walking around in nature like this and just living life and not constantly being stressed about trying to acquire things or go to places to impress other people who don't even care about them.